and we're going live. So last time we ended abruptly. You guys have probably no access. I know you don't. I still need to post the video for last meeting. I've been tinkering my computer since then, but you'll see it later today when I finally get it up. Last meeting, it cut off abruptly. But what we did in that last meeting is we summarized, or we began to sort of like go over the first meditation. And in the first meditation, basically Descartes he's trying to start over. He's lived through the scientific revolution. We talked about this at length in the last couple of meetings that are already up. So he was living through this time period when people like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, they were developing new ways of understanding our universe that were much more effective and accurate, and started to undermine earlier approaches to astronomy and physics and all sorts of other natural sciences. And so Descartes is living in this very, you could say, turbulent time, revolutionary time, but uncertain time in science and philosophy. And he doesn't like that. He wants certainty. And so at the outset of the first meditation, he sort of tells himself that, look, all this stuff I was taught, as a young scholar, turned out to be false. That the earth is at the center of the universe and all the other stuff that was undermined by the scientific revolution. And so I've got to start over. I've got to somehow wipe the slate clean, demolish all of my old beliefs. And that's basically the focus of the first meditation. We got through most of it. Unfortunately, again, it got cut off very abruptly at the end. But how does he do this? How does he go about undermining all of his beliefs? He feels like he needs to justify dismissing them. So he sets up a standard for himself. He says, if it's not certain, if it's not certain or indubitable, if there's any possibility for me to doubt it, I'm going to doubt it. So that's sort of his criteria. And he goes looking at all his beliefs, and he realizes he can't go through all his beliefs. That would take forever, be endless perhaps. So he's going to attack the foundations of his beliefs, because he believes that if he can show that the foundations have a basis for doubt, if the foundations of his beliefs have a basis for doubt, then all the other beliefs that are built on those foundations will also crumble. So that's his strategy. Let's attack the foundational beliefs, and all the other beliefs built on those foundational beliefs will fall as well. So he does that, and what he takes as his first target are the senses. He thinks that through the senses, this is where most of my beliefs have been derived, is through my senses, and I take that to be the most true. But can I doubt my senses? Is it possible that my senses can deceive me? And he says, well, yeah, it is possible. Sometimes my senses do deceive me. And for a moment he hesitates. He says, well, come on, sometimes my senses deceive me, but is it always? I mean, it's just special cases, like when something's far away or it's really close, or blurry, whatever. But then he starts to say, yeah, but how do I even know I'm even here right now? This could all be a dream. Then he goes into this sort of crazy dream thought experiment. And while he's operating under this assumption that everything's a dream, just for the sake of argument, he's saying, well, let's just make it hard on ourselves. Let's just say everything is a dream. I would still know that colors exist. Maybe they just exist in my head, but certainly orange is real insofar as there is a color orange, and there are shapes, there are feelings. They all might be just in my dream world, and so that's true. Like I lose this external world out there, but there's a lot I would retain, even if life were a dream, even if everything were just in my head. And he even includes, probably more importantly than all that I've mentioned so far, mathematics, geometry. 2 + 2 would still be 4, whether I'm dreaming or not. A circle would still have all the properties that a circle has, whether I'm dreaming a circle or whether there's actually a circle separate from my dreams. But then, and this is when we get to the very end of the first meditation, he comes up with the evil genius hypothesis. He says, now, he's very careful because he wants to be pious. He doesn't want to be blasphemous. In fact, if you read the introduction of this, he thinks this essay is actually doing a service to the church. So he doesn't want to blame God for any deception. So he comes up with this evil genius hypothesis instead. You know, he asks himself, well, what if, let's just imagine that there were this powerful evil genius who is constantly deceiving me about everything in the entire world. Everything that I see, everything that I understand, everything that I believe is actually false. I'm led to believe certain things, and they're always, always, always false. How could I know anything if that were true? Now, of course, don't take him the wrong way. He doesn't believe this. People say this in their papers. Descartes believed there was an evil. No, he did not believe there was an evil genius. He knows this sounds nuts. But at this point, he has no way to disprove it. There's no way, you know, he's not going to, he's like, well, if there were an evil genius, I wouldn't know. I believe that there wasn't. And so until he can somehow come up with an argument that undermines the possibility of an evil genius hypothesis, then he feels like he's pretty much committed himself to a very radical skepticism. And that's kind of what he was looking for. Remember, as I said at the outset, his goal here in the first meditation is to wipe the slate clean. And I suppose this does that. The evil genius, according to him, if there's an evil genius, everything's gone. All his beliefs are up for grabs. Well, except for one particular belief, and that's where we'll sort of begin today in the second meditation, right? There, even if, let's say, there's an evil genius, Descartes asserts that he can be skeptical about pretty much everything, but there's one thing that he could never doubt. It's not much, though, you could argue, what he does know. We'll get to it in just a moment, right? You'll know what I'm talking about here in just a minute, if you don't already. He doesn't want to be this absolute skeptic. He doesn't want to be a solipsist either. Maybe I should write that word solipsism too, because this is important. Not only has he committed himself to a very extreme form of skepticism, doubting everything. My body might be an illusion. Everything might be an illusion. Everything except for I'm just having dreams or something, and there's an evil genius controlling all my thoughts, and all my beliefs are false. And there really are none of these things, not even colors. Those don't even exist. Those are just, I believe they exist, but they don't. Yeah, something like this. So not only has he committed himself to this, very extreme skepticism, he's also committed himself to what we call solipsism. And what that means is that at this point, not only does Descartes not know if the world exists or colors or, he doesn't know if anybody else exists. For all he knows, he's the only thing that there is, right? So this is a sort of a solipsism. All that exists are the contents of his own experience. For all he knows, there are no other things out there. In a way, I think I kind of gave away what I was hinting at earlier. If somebody wants to jump in and guess, what is the one thing he could never doubt? This is what he sort of asserts right at the beginning of the meditation, the second meditation, which is what we're going to focus on today. Hopefully we get to the third. I don't know. We'll have time. But what's the one thing, even if there's an evil genius, what could he never doubt? And he's going to, and honestly, this is going to be the basis for a lot of philosophy after Descartes. A lot of philosophers, whether they agree with him in the grand scheme of things, a lot of philosophers after Descartes kind of start where he starts, with this basic truth, the one thing we could never doubt. Each one of us knows it for sure. Even if our whole life is an illusion, what can we always assert is true? Yeah, Dylan, you gotta.
Yeah, I'm just go with the basic assumption that it's better known than, based on the title, that is better known than the body. So I'm assuming that he knows himself is,
Good. Okay, so you're looking at the title of the second meditation. So the title of the second meditation, concerning the nature of the human mind, that it is better known than the body, right? So very good guess. Yes, it's the mind or the self or whatever you want to call it. He's going to say That's the one thing I know for sure. Everything could be illusion. Everything that I believe could be wrong and false, but I'm here to believe it. And so, this phrase that I have up here on the screen, this Latin phrase, this is what he's famous for. It means I think, therefore I am. Cogito, I think. Ergo, therefore, sum, I am. Right? Anytime I can try to deny my own existence. Maybe I don't exist. In order to deny my own existence, I have to exist to deny my existence. And maybe the evil genius tricks me into thinking that I exist. Well, I have to exist to be tricked, so that doesn't make sense. So I can always be sure of my own existence. That's sort of the Cartesian starting point. My certainty of myself, and he's going to unpack what that means. What is myself? What is the mind? And as you point out the title, right, that the mind is better known than the body, and so we have to understand. Well, what do we know about our mind? What can we say about our mind? And that's largely a focus of the second meditation. Also, you're going to see in the process, he's going to provide an argument for his rationalism. If you don't remember what that was, rationalism is ultimately the theory that he's going to support, he's going to argue for, the epistemological theory of knowledge, that states all of our knowledge is defined by and understood through our reasoning, our understanding, our ability to understand concepts and apply those concepts, not through our senses. Remember, for him, it's not the senses, it's the mind, it's the understanding. So as he's thinking about what the mind is, what is this cogito? What is this thinking that is being done by the being that I am? What is the nature of the self? Through that reflection, and through some sort of demonstration we're going to get to later, he's going to observe this object, this wax honeycomb. He's going to use that to support a sort of rationalist position. But at this point, and again, you got it, Dylan. It's the mind. That's all he really knows for sure, and he wants to know more than that. If you're some philosopher who's like being asked for wisdom, oh, Descartes, you're some wise philosopher. Well, what do you know? I exist. Well, what else do you know? Well, that's about it. I just know that I exist. That's pretty lame. He wants to get out of this, but he really can't do it until he disproves this evil genius hypothesis. And he thinks he can do that by proving that God exists. And I was trying to explain at the end of class last time. You'll see this when I finally post the last lecture, if you review it. I'm trying to explain what the connection between God and the evil genius hypothesis is, and I got cut off. But Dylan, you had your hand up real quick before I kind of explain that. What, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, more so a comment. I kind of recognize, especially with the Enlightenment period, that kind of goes hand in hand, especially with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I know I was reading one of his autobiography, The Confessions, and he was he's a big follower of Rene Descartes.
Right.
So just to emphasize that, it's fascinating to correlate the two.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Rousseau, because Rousseau, Kant, especially like someone like Kant, who, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but like Kant and Rousseau Rousseau influenced Kant, and a little bit vice versa, but not quite as much. But they use this notion of the self as the sort of certainty to start from. And not only is it a basis for their epistemology and like how you know what you know and where your wisdom comes from and all that, but also as the basis for like human rights or natural rights or political rights. And so, I mean, I think that Descartes' influence can't really be understated. And people think that he's overrated. I get that, because I think, you're going to see later when he gets to some of his arguments. Some of his arguments are pretty flimsy. He's not the strongest philosopher. But the questions that he asks and kind of the framework that he sets up, the way that he goes about asking the questions, had such an impact on philosophers after him, and other, like what you're calling Enlightenment philosophers. And this is the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, which ultimately culminates in people like Rousseau. but back to the point at hand, right? He really can't say much besides that I exist until he can get rid of this evil genius hypothesis that's kind of hanging over his head. And he thinks the way out of that, all he needs to do to undermine this evil genius hypothesis is to prove the existence of God. Which sounds kind of like a tall order, but he's not. He's like, oh no, it's easy. He's got several proofs. And I don't want y'all to get excited. Students always get like, oh wow, that sounds cool. I want to hear this proof for. They're honestly, I don't really think they're very impressive. To be honest, usually proofs for God's existence, for or against, by the way, are typically, pretty, I would say pretty weak, or at least unsatisfactory, for or against. But why does he think, though? Let's just say, okay, you got a great proof. Let's just say, why is there a relationship between proving God's existence and disproving this hypothesis? And this was very interesting to me. There's no way you would have seen this because I haven't posted the video yet. But for the first time, I had some students that were kind of like, they were questioning his logic here. And to me, I mean, I'm not really very a religious person, but even though I'm not, I kind of think it makes sense. He's making this argument that if I prove God exists, I disprove the evil genius exists because God would not allow this deception to occur, right? Like God is, if God exists and God is good, then God would not allow an evil genius to constantly trick me. That would not be something that God would allow happen. In a universe where there's a God, there couldn't be an evil genius deceiving you about everything that you see. But I had a few students push back on me. They were like, well, no, maybe God would let you be deceived by the evil genius or something like that. And I'm like, well, why would he do that? And maybe, I've been thinking about the last couple of days because it was so unusual. I'd never had that response before. And I kind of had this knee-jerk reaction, like, really? Like, I think it makes complete sense. If God is good and God's all powerful, like, why would he allow you to be tricked by an evil genius? Like, I think some of them where they were coming from was, well, the world's not perfect. And, you got to understand that error and imperfection are a part of life and a part of the universe. So, but this is not even like sometimes things are imperfect. If we're in evil genius land, nothing ever comes out right. Everything's an error. Everything is false. I can admit, there's arguments for why God would allow certain bad things to happen, or he would allow certain errors to occur. People can fall, but would God allow a constant deception like this? I don't think so. But if you've got an argument, I'm interested in reading a paper where a student defends on, like, why would God allow an evil genius to happen? Like, what would the justification for that be? Like, how could you justify tricking one of your, if you really care about your creation and you really like love them and you want them the best for them, let's say, why would you want them to be completely ignorant about all truth at all times and never know the truth, like, ever? Dylan, you maybe you have a suggestion?
Oh, yes, sir. So would they consider, what exactly did he see the evil genius hypothesis as? Could it be seen as like the devil, the enemy?
Yeah, I mean,
what type of?
Well, sometimes it's actually translated as demon. The word is daimon, which is kind of misleading because you think demon, evil, but it's sort of like a spirit or like a tricky, whatever. But it's just a thought experiment. He's saying, like, what if, and he's saying that, like, so you're thinking, like, I guess you're thinking of, like, maybe like in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you've got the devil. But even like the devil, like, if I'm kind of seeing where you're going with this, maybe, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. But even if you have the devil, that's like, the devil can trick you. The devil can deceive you, sure. But this is even worse than the devil. This is like, he's not just deceiving you, and it's possible that if you're good and you follow the truth, that you can get away from it. Like, this is a situation where there's no outs. Like, no matter what, you're just brainwashed from beginning to end to believe falsehoods. So, you're right, I think, to sort of like think of it in that sense, but I think it's even more It's even more bleak than that. You know, like in the Christian tradition, I'm assuming, look, yes, the devil tempts you, but you have free will, or you have a possibility for salvation. This is like there's no possibility for salvation. Like you're just, no matter what you do, you're gonna believe falsehood. Um, I don't see how that could be justified. You know, I would say, like, yeah, if there was a God, I don't think that and if that God was good and cared about you, I don't see how that God would allow that to happen. You know, so it's sort of like the devil, but not quite. Because, like, again, yeah, like from my understanding of the notion of Satan, devil, whatever, the adversary, um, that you can triumph over that demon, you know, if you follow the true faith or whatever, live a good life, however you read the, you know, the tradition. But this is even worse. So, you know, so I'm kind of with him. Like, again, I don't think his argument for God is that strong, but I think, like, yeah, if you prove that God exists and that God is good, I guess that this does kind of make it seem at least implausible. I can't imagine a scenario where this would be good. Um, I guess maybe like I'm trying to think of like some really wacky scenarios. Maybe in a case where the person was like, if somebody was so bad that it's better that they were ignorant and so they never got. I don't know. I'm sort of getting sidetracked here. We should maybe even talk about this more in the next meeting, because even though it's, to me, probably like super important for him to focus on this, and maybe this should be what he focuses on now, he doesn't get to the proof for God's existence till meditation 3. You know, in meditation 2, as you point out, he's going to focus on the mind and explain how the mind is better known than the body. But it's like, okay, great, but if all you have is a mind and nothing else, like, that's a pretty lame theory of knowledge. I want to know more about the world than just that I exist. So we have to get to God for that. So, but we, you know, think about it. We can revisit this question, but I think it kind of at least it intuitively makes sense to me that, yeah, like if there was a God, then the evil genius hypothesis would probably be pretty, at least implausible, if not impossible, unless you can explain how that's a good, fair, just situation for poor Descartes, you know, being never having a chance of knowing what's true. That would be awful. But I'm going to read from, this is on page 17. It's the second paragraph of the meditation 2. And I've already kind of explained it. But this is where he kind of leads up to the realization that I do know that I exist. You know, that's the one thing I could never doubt, even if the evil genius were around tricking me. So he says, therefore I will suppose that everything I see is false. I believe none of what my deceitful memory represents ever existed. I have no senses whatsoever. Body, shape, extension, you know, taking up space, extension in space, um, movement, place. These are all chimeras, right? They're all just falsities made up of just fictions and conglomerations of falsities. Well, what then will be true? Perhaps just the single fact that nothing is certain. But how do I know that there's not something else over and above all those things that I have just reviewed, concerning which there's not even the slightest occasion for doubt? Is there not some God, or by whatever name I might call him, who instills these very thoughts in me? But why would I think that, since I myself could perhaps be the author of these thoughts? Am I not then at least something? But I've already denied that I have any senses and any body. Still I hesitate. For what follows from this? Am I so tied to a body and to senses that I cannot exist without them? But I have persuaded myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world. No sky, no earth, no minds, right, Mr. Solipsist? I'm the only, you know, no minds, no bodies. Is it then the case that I too do not exist? But doubtless I did exist, if I persuaded myself of something. But there's a deceiver, or some other supremely powerful and deceitful being who's always deliberately deceiving me. Well, then too, there's no doubt that I exist. If he is deceiving me, and let him do his best at deception, he will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall think that I am something. Thus, after everything has been most carefully weighed, it must finally be established that this pronouncement, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. Right? So that's his foundation, right? In the first meditation, he clears all his former beliefs and he starts from a certain foundation, the certainty of himself, the cogito, the I think, right? The thinking thing is what he calls it. See if I can, geez. Okay, let me get a new slide going here. I thought that I had done a little slide on this, but I guess not. This is actually from last semester. Another horrible thing that happened when my computer crashed. I lost the new Descartes PowerPoint that I'd been working on this semester, so I had to grab this old one. So let me get this new slide going. Okay, so he's sort of he's like pausing here for a minute. He's like, all right, I've discovered something. I've got a self, and I could never deny it, and that's a certainty. Okay, cool. How can we sort of move out from this? And then he's like, well, wait a minute. This kind of sucks because if we think about it, what am I, right? What is what am I, right? What is the self? Now, he hesitates to say that it's a rational animal, right? This is a kind of philosophical definition of human. The human being is a rational animal. This goes back at least as far as Aristotle. Now, he doesn't want to define himself as a rational animal because he says, well, then I have to explain what an animal is, then I have to explain what reason is. And so let me start with concepts that are directly intuitive, directly known, that don't require explanation. He believes that the concept of a thing is such a concept. He's like, well, I'm a thing. I am a kind of a thing. So he says that a thing doesn't need to be defined. What a thing is, even before you know the word thing, you know what a thing is. Apparently, this is what he's going to argue. Maybe you're a baby, you still know that this thing is different from that thing, even though you don't know what the heck they are. You know that they're things. So he thinks that doesn't need explanation. That's something that is just directly known. It's self-evident. All beings know. All conscious beings know what a thing is. So he defines himself as a thing that thinks. Right? What is the essential activity of the self? It's thought. So this is the way that Descartes defines himself. He is a thinking thing. He's a mind. Okay. Very technical sounding, huh? Right? Thinking thing. Right? And then he gives us a list, right? He gives us a list of all that entails. And it's a pretty short list. He says, this is on page 20, I think. Yeah, this is that. It's really short paragraph on page 20. The second paragraph. He says, "Well, what am I? A thing that thinks. What is that? It's a thing that doubts." Okay, let me put all this up here. It doubts, as he's doing right now, pretty much doubting everything except for his own existence. It doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses to will, imagines, and senses. Okay? That's what a thinking thing is. That's what it does. That's what the concept of thinking thing entails. that's all we can say with certainty about the thinking thing. Whether what it's understanding is true, whether what it's affirming is true, whether what it's denying is true, that we can't know at this point. We still haven't really established an epistemology yet for Descartes, but we know that this is true. At least this is his argument, right? Yeah, Dylan.
So I'm assuming what he did is to emphasize the simplicity of, like, the statement thinking thing. It's basically to minimize the complexity and less explanation.
Right, right. And in a way, this is kind of counterintuitive. It seems like, well, the thing that's so important and that is the basis for all other knowledge, you might think that it'd be more complicated and there'd be more to say about it. And he kind of points this out. He says, well, okay, so we've got this thing we call a mind. And we also have this thing we call a body. And at this point, he's saying, I don't even know if I have a body. I can't deny I have a mind. I could never doubt that. But maybe my body's an illusion. I don't want to think so. I want to believe I have a body. But at this point, I'm only certain of my thought. I'm only certain that my thought exists. But then he reflects on it. He said, well, this is kind of embarrassing what I just said, because when I talk about the things I know about the mind, it's a pretty short list, as you put it. It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. It's kind of abstract. It's not really, there's not much content. These are all active verbs. They're actions. Doubting, refusing. They're not like, there's not much content. It's just what one can do with the mind. But it doesn't tell you what it's thinking, what it's doubting, what it's understanding. But if you think about, the knowledge that you believe you have about your own body, it seems like there's more to say about the body. If you had to, let's imagine that you had some homework assignment, perhaps, where your teacher wanted you to write a descriptive essay, either on the mind or the human body. Which of those two essays would be longer, do you think? I mean, well, if you had to give a lot of detail, as much detail as possible. Descartes arguing that the body would be easier. You could talk about all the different the parts of your body and your internal organs and your respiratory system and cardiovascular system and nervous system and the brain and all this. But according to him, the mind, he just wrote your paper for you. This is all you could say about it. The mind is a thing that doubts, thinks, understands. That's it. So he's like, well, wait a minute. If the mind is the thing I'm certain of, it seems like I should know and have more to say about it. But then he says, well, let's step back a bit and reflect. Even though the mind is something that is quite simple and basic and something that is just intuitive and directly known, doesn't discount its importance in our acquisition of knowledge. Just because it seems like we're more familiar with talking about it, and it's easier to talk about things that are physical and are corporeal. He likes to use that word corporeal, right? Having a body. It's easier and more. It's easier. It's not as difficult. It's less abstract to talk about those things. He's going to argue that we would not have any knowledge of those things. We would not have any knowledge of those things unless we had a mind, right? The mind, what he's going to call the understanding here in this next few passages I'm going to read. The mind, the understanding, is the basis for our knowledge of any body whatsoever. Our own body, that body over there, right? Any object, he's going to say, is only known through this cogito, through this thinking thing. And so now we finally get to his famous example of the wax. And I guess this is kind of the highlight of the second meditation. Even though the title is I think almost all the titles to the meditations are slightly misleading, because yes, he does talk about the distinction between the mind and the body, and that the mind is better known than the body. But really, I think if you look at this wax example, he's kind of killing two birds with one stone, and it's much more obvious that he's setting the groundwork for his rationalist position. Remember, rationalism, the idea that knowledge is based on reason, understanding. opposed to the senses. Knowledge is not based on the senses. He's going to be very emphatic about that. That's the empiricist view. We'll talk about the empiricists later this semester when we're getting close to the end of Descartes. But he's going to say, look, my knowledge of things is always going to be based on my understanding. Okay, so that's, I have here at the bottom. Maybe I should put that in bold. Understanding. Okay. For instance, he says, let's look at this piece of wax. Let's not think about bodies in general and make generalizations. Let's just get real specific and look at this piece of wax. So he takes this wax, this honeycomb, and he asks, how do I know the things that I know about this wax? So let's actually read the passage where he goes through this example, and then we'll try to unpack it and see, what is he arguing here? What is his basic point? This is on page, let me see, page 21.
21.
Yeah, 21. It's the second paragraph. He says, let's consider those things which are commonly believed to be the most distinctly grasped of all, namely the bodies that we touch and see. Not bodies in general, mind you, for the general perceptions are apt to be somewhat more confusing. But let's just take one body in particular. Let's take, for instance, this piece of wax. It's been taken quite recently from the honeycomb. It has not yet lost all the honey flavor. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was collected. Its color, shape, size are manifest. It is hard and cold. It is easy to touch. If you rap on it with your knuckle, it will emit a sound. In short, everything is present in it that appears needed to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. But notice that as I'm speaking, I'm bringing it close to the fire. The remaining traces of the honey flavor are disappearing. The scent is vanishing. I just lost my spot, sorry. The scent is vanishing. The color's changing. The original shape is disappearing. Its size is increasing. It's becoming liquid and hot. You can hardly touch it. And now when you rap on it, it no longer emits any sound. Does the same wax still remain? I must confess that it does. No one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. So what was there in the wax that was so distinctly grasped? Certainly none of the aspects that I reach by means of the senses. For whatever came under the senses of taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing has now changed. And yet the wax remains. So he's observing it, he's looking at this wax with his senses, but he wants to be very insistent that that's not where the knowledge of the wax comes from. Why not? What's his argument here? Well, I'm looking at the wax. It has a certain shape. It's a honeycomb still. I just got it. It's still maybe still a little sticky. It still smells kind of sweet. It's kind of hollow, so it can make a noise if you hit it on the table. But then I put it close to the fire, and it gets hot, and every single thing about it is different. Everything about what I see is different. The way it looks, its shape, it's the way it feels. It's no longer solid, it's liquid. But yet my mind, what Descartes is calling this aspect of my mind, the understanding, my capacity to understand what wax is, that's what lets me know. Why can't I go with just my senses? If I went with just my senses alone, what would I have to conclude? Well, his argument is that I would not even know that it's the same object. Every time it's changing, it'd have to be a different thing. Why would I call it the same thing? If I'm going just on my senses alone, my senses report constant change. But yet I know it's the same. It looks different, but it's still the same wax. It's taken a different form, but it's my understanding of what wax is, what wax does, under certain conditions. That's what makes me know that it's the same. Not my senses. And not my imagination either. This is another aspect of, I guess, our mind. Not only does our mind understand things, but our mind can also imagine things. And I take what Descartes means by this is, our ability to picture things in our head, to come up with possibilities in our head that aren't real but could be real perhaps, or maybe even couldn't be real, but we take what is real or what we have experienced and sort of create an image in our head or a thought or an idea. He doesn't think that our knowledge of the wax is based on our imagination either. It must be our understanding. What is his argument for that? I guess I can kind of see the senses, but what's the imagination? What's wrong with the imagination? Well, there are certain things we all know about the wax if we just reflect on it. Everyone listening to me probably knows the answer to this question. If you just think about it, some it'll be super obvious. Some might take a second to think about it, but eventually you'll realize the answer. The question is, how many different shapes can the wax take? How many shapes can I shape wax into? How many shapes? Is there a number of shapes? A limit? Is there any shape you can't shape wax into? Is it impossible to shape wax into a certain shape? No one knows the answer.
I'm assuming he uses the reference as the solid liquid gas.
Well, I mean, I guess solid liquid gas. I mean, well, you can melt the wax and then it dries up again and becomes a solid again. But I'm just saying, like, can it take? How many shapes can it take? Whether it's liquid or solid, how many different ways can you? How many different ways can you shape clay?
Infinite.
Thank you. Infinite. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, and same thing with wax. You can shape it as many shapes as there are shapes, right? As many variations as there are, an infinite amount. There's no limit. If it's a shape, wax can take it, okay? How do you know that? How do you know that? Descartes' going to say, you know it, I know it, we all know it, but how do we know it? We don't know it because of our senses. You didn't sit there and look for an infinite amount of time. You didn't watch wax, like you didn't take a piece of wax one day and shape it an infinite amount of shapes and looked at each one of them. You didn't imagine it either. You didn't sit there in your mind and just imagine, oh, let me imagine the wax shaped like this. Let me imagine the wax shaped like that. No. He says you just know. Once you understood that wax could be shaped and it was completely malleable, you just knew you could shape it however you wanted to. And that was what he calls, that was your understanding. Not your senses, not your imagination, but what he's calling your understanding. Your ability to understand concepts, to understand the substance of things. What does it really mean to be wax? What does wax do? And again, this is sort of, I guess, evidence in favor of the importance, the fundamentality of the mind over the body, and support for his rationalist epistemology, his rationalist theory of knowledge, that knowledge is not based on senses, knowledge is not based on experience, knowledge is based on reason, on understanding. But how do we even know that wax exists at this point? How do we know that our own body exists at this point? He still hasn't really answered the skeptic. He still hasn't really answered this whole evil genius hypothesis problem. So this is where we turn to meditation 3. So let me see how I'm doing on time. Do I want to get started on meditation 3? I think I better. I mean, I've only got about 20 minutes. I don't want to get too far into it. Well, let's get just a basic start. Okay, so he's going to say, let's skip forward to page 25. Yeah, real quick, before I do that, let me make sure everyone's cool. Dylan, you had a question or a comment?
Yes, I'm just having I was looking at page 22, I see that he states right above line 32, so I'm assuming 31, but it says, meanwhile, I marvel at how prone my mind is to error. For although I am considering these things within myself silently and without words. So I would be assuming that maybe he's emphasizing to the waxes, as maybe his God. It could be taken that as a presumption.
Yeah. Well, he's gonna. In fact, this is, and I don't know if we want to follow this too much. When we get to meditation 4, he's I think gonna. I'm not quite sure I'm hearing your concerns correctly, so feel free to correct me. But I think he's probably going to answer your concerns in meditation 4, which is called concerning the true and false. So he knows that, okay, so my mind is definitely essential for knowledge. That doesn't mean his mind is perfect, right? He's not God, right? Obviously. He's not, well, I guess it should be obvious that he's not God, right? For all we know, maybe he's super skeptical. Who knows what's true at this point, right? But he's like, yeah, like my mind is prone to error, although I'm thinking of myself, sees upon these words themselves, and I'm nearly deceived by the ways in which people commonly speak. Yeah. Yeah, so again, I could dwell on that a little bit, but he's going to explain in the 4th meditation how it is that error is possible. Because I think this might be what was confusing my students in my 11 a.m. class when I was trying to talk to them about what the relationship between God's existence and the sort of defeat of his evil genius hypothesis. Um, he's not making the claim that if he proves God exists, that he's perfect, right? He's not saying, well, if I prove God exists, I disprove the evil genius, and that means everything that I believe is true. He's not saying that, right? Obviously, people make mistakes. We are fallible. The question is then, how do you know when you made a mistake? How do you know when you're in error and when you're not? How do you know when your senses are deceiving you and when they're not deceiving you? This is something he thinks he can figure out, but he's going to wait a while. I think he's going to start working it out in the 4th meditation, but I would argue you really don't get an answer till the end of the darn freaking essay. Until the very end of the essay, you finally get this somewhat worked out view of how it is we know when we're wrong, how we can avoid making errors, what the reason for our errors is. And he doesn't want to blame God, of course. That would be sacrilegious. How do I make mistakes? Why is that okay? Why is that permitted? And how can we avoid them in the future? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, like I said, I hope when we get to the 4th meditation, it'll be a little bit more clear. But if we look, what did I say, page 25? If we look on page 25, he kind of reiterates the point that I keep trying to sort of, maybe I keep saying this too much and I'm over explaining it. But on 25, it's above that 37 in the column, the line 37 or paragraph 37, I think is actually what it is. I think the numbers, Dylan, are actually paragraph numbers. They might actually be page numbers from the original edition or something like that. I'm really not quite sure. But it's right above the 37. There's a few lines above it, about 4 or 5 lines above it. He says, certainly because I have no reason for thinking there's a God who is a deceiver, and of course I do not yet sufficiently know whether there is a God. He's going to have to prove that first. He says the basis for doubting, depending as it does merely on the above hypothesis, on the evil genius hypothesis, is tenuous, right? He's only assuming it for a minute. He's going to dispel it, and it's, so to speak, metaphysical. So in order to remove this basis for doubt, in order to destroy the evil genius hypothesis, I should at the first opportunity inquire whether there is a God, and if there is, whether or not he can be a deceiver. And if I'm ignorant of this, it appears I'm really never capable of being completely certain of anything. So he's got to start with that. We got to prove that God exists and that God is not some deceiver. And then we can know all these other things. Then we can get into other things. In a way, maybe I don't think this is going to satisfy you probably in your question, but in a way, you might argue that in the next paragraph, oh, sorry, the last paragraph there at the bottom of page 25, um, he kind of gets started. He begins fleshing out a theory of how errors are possible or how to spot them, or at least what they are. So let me actually read that at the bottom. He says, as far as ideas are concerned, let's talk about ideas. Let me see.
Are you at the bottom at 25?
Yeah, bottom of 25. It's the very last line on 25. He says, as
Oh,
far
the
as
one
I,
that.
yeah, go ahead.
You talking about the one that says now as far?
Yeah, now as far as
Okay.
ideas are concerned, yeah, exactly. Let me get a new slide going here. So he's talking about ideas, right? Ideas. What am I experiencing subjectively? You know, when he uses the word idea, it's very broad. When I say idea, I'm thinking of like I got a thought in my head, but he uses the words thoughts and he uses the words ideas very broadly. Anything that's a content of your experience would be an idea or a thought. I don't know if I like that definition. I think it's a little too general or whatever, but that's how he sees it. So if it's an idea, he says, as far as ideas are concerned, if they are considered alone and in their own right, without being referred to something else, they cannot, properly speaking, be false. So whether, like, let's say I have just I imagine a unicorn in my head and I'm picturing it. He says, well, that's not false. Like, I'm having an idea of a unicorn. So the idea in itself is never false. Whether it's something fictitious, like he says, a she-goat or a chimera, you know, whether it's a she-goat or chimera that I'm imagining, it's no less true that I imagine the one than the other. Moreover, we need not fear that there is falsity in the will itself or in the affects. Okay, so also the will or the affects, like I guess, you know, how I'm affected by things emotionally, um, what I decide to do with my will, my choice. Now, I can decide to do evil things. I can decide to do good things. I can feel good things. I can feel evil things. But whether whether that's true or false is not an issue. It's true that I will things. It's true that I have. So ideas, my will, my affects are true. There's no falsity there. There's no possibility for falsity there. Okay. So again, you know, he kind of explains himself about the will. You know, he admits, yeah, I can do evil stuff with my will, but it's true that I did evil things with my will, right? We need not fear that there's falsity in the will itself or in the affects, for although I can choose evil things or even things that are utterly non-existent, like I can wish, like I want a purple dinosaur for a pet. Okay, yeah, I can wish that, and it's true that I wish it. I cannot conclude from this that it is untrue that I do choose these things. Thus, there remain only judgments. So ideas in themselves can't be false. The will, insofar as it wills, is not false. The affects are not false, insofar as they're there. But what he's calling judgments, that is where falsehood is concerned. He says, only judgments remain in which I must take care not to be mistaken. Now, the principal and most frequent error to be found in judgments consists, and now he's going to explain where error comes in. How do I make mistakes? It's when I make a certain judgment. It consists in the fact that I judge that certain ideas which are in me are similar to or in conformity with certain things outside me. Obviously, if I were to consider these ideas merely as modes of my thought and were not to refer them to anything else, they could hardly give me any subject matter for error. So when I think about a unicorn, obviously the idea is true. Like I'm thinking of a unicorn. But when I make a judgment, I say, oh, this idea that I'm having of a unicorn corresponds to an actual thing outside of me, as he puts it. Let me get his wording exact here. What does he say? I judge that the ideas which are in me are similar to or in conformity with certain things outside me. You know, so if we look at this little picture that I have up here, right? You got this guy looking at the tree, the object. The object is, I guess, rays of light are bouncing off the tree and entering into this into the optic nerve, and the brain is processing it, and we have this experience of the tree, right? Now, I'm looking at the tree, let's say, and I'm like, that's a really nice tree, and I'm making a judgment about it. Or I'm not even saying it's nice. I'm just saying it's a tree. Just the bare assertion that it's a freaking tree. Whether or not that judgment is true or false depends on its conformity or similarity with the actual object out there. So maybe I judge that it's a tree, but then I walk up closer to it and it's really just a fake tree or a cardboard cutout, a flat two-dimensional tree. That would be an error, right? The idea that I have in my mind does not correspond to anything out there. You know, and so ultimately, and we're going to see this, I think I should probably start winding down and maybe get the meeting over with here, because I think we're going to have we're going to cover too much ground if we go further. I think we've probably covered enough material for one meeting, and if we start getting into the next move he's going to make, it's going to just it'd be overwhelming. It'll be too much for one lecture. But just to sort of wind things down, when we do get to his argument for the existence of God, you know, there's a reason why he's making all these points about judgments and the conformity of my idea with the judgment of something that's actually existing outside of me. He's going to start with the idea of God. That's why I put the word God in quotation marks. And he believes that by reflecting on the concept, the idea of God, that we can somehow actually get to the existence of God. So let me put an arrow pointing to God without quotation marks, right? So again, the idea, the concept, is going to build a bridge, a philosophical bridge, you know, you could argue, towards proving the existence of the actual deity, that there is something that corresponds to the idea, that there must be something that corresponds to the idea. And we'll see this next time. Again, I don't think we should get into the details just yet. We've covered enough ground, I think, for today. But yeah, for next class, good. We got through Meditation 2. So for next meeting on Tuesday at 11 a.m., I'll record the lecture for Meditation 3. We'll go over proofs for God, the first proof for God's existence. Descartes has a few proofs for God up his sleeve. We'll cover that. We'll see some of maybe the flaws with it, try to explain it, work it through. So by next week, read Meditation 3, and 1 week from today at this time at 1 p.m. we'll do Meditation 4. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording now. Let me go ahead and hit stop on the record.